A quarter of a century ago, on February 26, 1991, during the famous Operation Desert Storm, tanks of the US Army VII Corps met in battle with tanks of the Iraqi Republican Guard. Thus began one of the largest tank battles in the history of warfare. First battle. By the end of February 1991, there was two news for the Iraqi units involved in the occupation of Kuwait: good and bad. The good news was that weeks of aerial bombing had caused relatively little damage to several tank and mechanized units. For example, the 1st Mechanized Division, even according to U.S. estimates, retained about 90% of its combat power. The 6th Tank Division also remained almost untouched. The 50th Tank Brigade of the 12th Tank Division, thanks to the efforts of tank-loving commander Mohamed Ashad, lost only 8 tanks and several other armored vehicles. The elite armored and mechanized divisions of the Republican Guard, Tawakalna, Medina, and Hammurabi, amounted to 57% to 72% of their former strength and could even carry out counterattacks at the divisional level. On the other hand, Iraqi batteries and other vulnerable equipment had a hard time under attacks from aircraft and MLRS multiple launch rocket systems. The Iraqis could not even dream of air support. But that wasn't the worst news. The really bad news was that the U.S.-led coalition forces attacked in an unexpected place, not directly against the defenses prepared in Kuwait, but from the flank across the desert. The Iraqis had to urgently deploy the front and take up defensive positions in raw positions. On February 24 at 15 o'clock, the VII Corps of the U.S. Army went on the offensive. The corps included the 1st and 2nd Tank Divisions, the 1st Cavalry Division, which served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, the 1st Infantry Division, famous for the battles of World War II, the Big Red Unit, as well as the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. The right flank was provided by the British, the 1st Tank Division. The coalition attack was coordinated. The assault battalions on the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle went into battle under the cover of fire from 120mm tank guns. Each battalion was built as a combined combat group, with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Tanks with trawls and armored bulldozers cleared minefields and demolished wire fences. Sapper vehicles with 165mm cannons were working on bunkers. Smoke shells isolated Iraqi positions from each other. However, Iraqi soldiers continued to resist. The Iraqis probably expected the American motorized infantry to dismount, but this did not happen. The Abrams, with bulldozer blades mounted on them, reached the Iraqi positions, turned to the sides, and simply began digging trenches along with the defenders. For the first time since 1846, the U.S. Army won the first battle. However, instead of a quick breakthrough, the units had to stop to wait for their neighbors and attack in a coordinated manner. Some heavy tanks were stuck at the bottom of dry lakes, and trucks with ammunition got stuck in the sand, which suddenly turned into impassable mud after the rain. Tank battle among sandstorms. Meanwhile, the Iraqi command was preparing to repel a sudden threat. By February 26, the Medina Tank Division from northern Kuwait was transferred to the Rumaila oil fields 80 kilometers southwest of the Iraqi city of Basra. Tawakalna was located west of the IPS-8 oil pipeline leading to Saudi Arabia and waited in defensive positions facing west. The Hammurabi Division, depending on the circumstances, could either strengthen the Medina attack on the flank of the coalition forces in the west, or with the support of Tawakalna, hit the units rushing to the Euphrates. Finally, it could cover the retreat of the main forces of the Iraqi army from Kuwait, which began at 3 o'clock in the morning on February 26, approximately 14 hours before the start of the battle. Due to severe sandstorms, visibility with the naked eye dropped to less than 100 meters and only improved at times. Rain and sand hit my face. The reconnaissance helicopters had to land. Due to heavy clouds, the A-10 attack aircraft could not provide support. Then the Americans chose the tactics of a slow but reliable offensive. One platoon of combat vehicles carefully examined the area from the spot in search of the enemy. The gunners' thermal imagers made it possible to detect, but not identify, enemy equipment beyond 1.5 kilometers. The other platoon carefully advanced about a kilometer, after which it changed roles with the first. Of course, this would take a lot of time, but the American units would not have driven into a trap at once. Around noon on February 26, scouts from the forward units saw what they believed to be machine gun emplacements ahead of them. In fact, these turned out to be buried T-72 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Clouds hung in the air from the explosions of Iraqi artillery shells, which also discovered the enemy. The defense was frankly poorly prepared. The vehicles were dug in shallowly, without mutual fire support, almost without minefields and barbed wire barriers, with insufficient sectors of fire. It was probably assumed that the divisions of the Republican Guard would not stand passively in these positions, but at the right time would strike at the weak point of the attackers. The Tavakalna Mechanized Division had 220 T-72 tanks, 284 infantry fighting vehicles, 126 guns, and 18 multiple rocket launchers. Like the best units of the coalition, the Tawakalna battalions were combined combat groups created for a specific mission and included 3 companies of motorized rifles, a company of tanks, an artillery battery, a company of sappers, and an air defense battery. Reinforced infantry companies were placed in a triangle, 2 in front and 1 in depth. A tank platoon or company was often placed in the center of such a position. The infantry occupied trenches and bunkers. Their infantry fighting vehicles were covered by ramparts. However, the fortifications were not yet completed, so they were clearly visible even from a distance and were penetrated by tank shells. There was no protection from above either. In theory, the ratio of 10 to 12 defending battalions against a dozen attacking battalions gave the former a good chance of victory. In the battle, which lasted from approximately 18 o'clock on February 26 to 14 o'clock on February 27, the Republican Guard made every effort to stop and destroy the Americans. However, the opposite happened. Although some of the Iraqis, judging by the shelling, noticed the enemy in time, this information did not reach many lower units, who were taken by surprise. T-72s fired at the attackers from 2 long distances, about 2.5 kilometers. Naturally, from such a distance they did no harm. Artillery fire was also too inaccurate. Attempts to attack are brave, but inappropriate. 120 mm shells and TOW missiles quickly thinned out Iraqi tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and mortars, infantry hoping to get close to the enemy in the dark. However, in the end, over 800 tanks and 600 infantry fighting vehicles of the American Corps destroyed the vast majority of the Tavakalna equipment. 220 tanks and 270 infantry fighting vehicles. 18 hours later, the 1st Panzer Division crushed the Medina Division. Hammurabi, in turn, retreated. According to the U.S. military, this retreat was one of the most competent maneuvers of the Iraqi army during the entire war. Why Iraq lost both the battle and the war? According to some American analysts, the latest technologies, of course, helped the coalition fight, but they could not win the war for the people. American troops still had to use World War II-era compasses, paper maps, and radios, and the equipment continued to break down, as happened in previous conflicts. However, the coalition group had something extremely important: initiative. Throughout the war, the Iraqi army allowed the enemy to choose where and how to fight. Most units were simply waiting for American attacks, and attempts to attack tank units of the coalition ready for defense with the T-55, especially at night and without proper artillery support, led to predictable results. Although the result would probably still be the same, the only question is the price. The Iraqis were ready to fight, and often fought to the last opportunity, but they lacked the same level of technical proficiency as the American and British units. The coalition's best troops were transferred from Europe, where they were preparing to repel a likely Soviet attack. For obvious reasons, the most trained and equipped were selected for service at the forefront of a possible Third World War, and before the ground operation in Iraq, units at all echelons trained continuously, literally from morning to night. Moreover, they also practiced complex coordination, from helicopter crews to crews of anti-tank missiles and armored bulldozers. At the same time, the soldiers finally fired real rockets. Each battalion developed its own method of attacking specific Iraqi fortifications. Every day at 5 o'clock, all the soldiers took up their assigned combat positions, and the available equipment was started up and prepared for battle. At the same time, such training prevented possible attacks by saboteurs. The possibility of a large-scale attack by several divisions was also foreseen. Air superiority allowed the U.S. Corps commander to fly out several times a day if necessary, visiting each subordinate division. American units could attack not only forward positions, but also, with the help of NLRS, cannon artillery, and helicopters, strike in depth, especially against enemy batteries and rear units. American artillery was easily masked and controlled, unlike Iraqi artillery. Therefore, descriptions of the battle against the best and bravest of Iraqi units even entered the training programs of the U.S. Army.